I think it's 6:10, so I think we should begin this event. A launch of Christie's new book, The Architecture of Bathing, Body Landscape Art, and a talk by Christie Pearson. My name is Adrian Blackwell. I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo, and I'm honored to introduce Christie's talk. Christie's book starts with its own land acknowledgement, and I don't know if Christie was going to mention this, but she describes Mohawk artist Melissa General's video, Kearas, in which the artist collects water from the Grand River, water which serves as a material of medicine and healing, but also memory and connection to the land. Of course, the University of Waterloo School of Architecture is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And this territory is within the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And of course, many Indigenous people still live here. And I think Christie's acknowledgement of the river and the importance of the river for Indigenous peoples is very important. And it's nice the way she locates her book in the area where she teaches. About 20 years ago, I was walking down Harvard Avenue near University of Toronto when I bumped into a sidewalk book sale in front of Sivananda Yoga Vedanta Center. It was Christie selling her library, selling all her books. I picked up a copy of Gilles Deleuze's Masochism, which I enjoyed reading. I can't remember if she was selling her library because she was leaving town for Japan, or if it was because she was returning home and she no longer needed any possessions. But as a book hoarder, I was impressed by Christie's ability to give away her belongings. I've always understood that Christie is a special person who thinks about the world in terms of experience and relations, and not in terms of possession. Now she's written her own book, and reading the introduction to the book, I was struck by the following statement. A history of architecture that privileges objects with clearly defined boundaries sitting on a site like a hat on a chair offers a desiccated carcass of what architecture could be. If this description seems exaggerated, it still maintains a deep hold in the education and practice of architecture. There is no building without a profound connection to the world, of which it is an intrinsic part, and the experience of the people who use it. And I think this little statement for me encapsulates a lot of the ethos that Christie brings to teaching and her practice of architecture. I remember, since I've known her for a long time, we overlapped as an undergraduates at Waterloo. I taught in Rome when Christie's class was there. We collaborated on a number of urban interventions in the late 90s. I've taken yoga classes with Christie. We collaborated on the journal Scapegoat, Architecture, Landscape, Political Economy since 2010, and we've taught together in studios at both U of T and Waterloo. I remember Christie taking her students to baths in the Lower East Side of New York on field trips in 1990s or early 2000s, recommending texts like The Undercommons to her students, The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, which have inspired different kinds of projects at this school. Over this time, I've seen Christie participate in architectural teams that placed in some of the city's most important architectural competitions, like Dundas Square and the Student Center at University of Toronto, Mississauga. She's created her own collectives like Wade, which intervenes in wading pools in Toronto, and The Waves, which appropriated urban spaces like the Sunnyside Bathing Pavilion and the pool in Trinity Bellwoods Park. I've watched her edit issues of the journal Scapegoat on topics like eros and night. In all this work, Christie exhibits a relentless curiosity about the world, an ability to connect with people and environments, a vibrant creativity and a humility about her work. Christie is also a feminist materialist committed to social and ecological change. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Christie's book, The Architecture of Bathing. Thanks for joining us, Christie.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for coming out tonight in this moment of stress. There are many things competing for our attention right now, and it's great to be able to share with all of you in this place where I have so many connections and so much history. It's great to be able to share some of the fruits of work that's been engaged in here. And along with the book, what I'm going to try and present tonight are elements and ideas of the book and how it's organized and what it's trying to build connections to, as well as to put it into the context of the studio I'm teaching right now, Third Year Option Studio, which is about communal, new architectures of communal bathing. So we'll see a few elements from that studio as well. And so I guess I would like to start by just looking at the title here, The Architecture of Bathing. Why does this title seem a little bit funny, a little bit odd? Architecture and bathing, do they belong together? If they don't belong together, why don't they belong together? And I have an idea about that, a few ideas. I think that bathing, along with a whole host of other elements of life, day-to-day life, have been somewhat exiled from architecture, and I propose that we bring them back in. And these include relationships formed between architecture and bodies, between architecture and landscapes, between architecture and art. And let's look at a few more elements that are happening inside the bath. This image of the Naoshima bath, created by Shinro Otake in Naoshima, Japan, is so striking to me in its wealth of issues, ideas, and rich connectivities. We can see how the artist is playfully, and this is a very funny and somewhat, it's a complex, somewhat ironic art project, which is also an actual bath that the local residents can go and use as a day-to-day space. There are inversions of expectations at every corner in this bath. While we don't expect to see a taxidermied elephant in a cento, what we do come to expect as we look at more and more public bathing spaces, we do expect a kind of a thesis and a proposition about how we as humans relate to the non-human world. In structuring this book, I really struggled between different elements of the bath that are super, super important. How can we bring together what seem to be disparate programs from all over the world when we know they are somewhat similar? The sauna, the banya, the swimming pool, all of these are kind of typologies of bathing, architectural typologies that need to be looked at in context and in a global context especially. And over and again, I found myself unable to extract those typologies from landscape forms. They're always intertwined. So the sections, bodies, landscapes, and practices are somewhat tentative in that you will find each theme weaving itself through each chapter. Okay, so the first section looks at the individual tub, the tradition of the Roman thermae and its relationship to eroticism, the tradition of the public bath and its relationship to community. And these are extensions of the single body and the communal body. Bathing through the lens of, we can see some of the patterns that come up through looking at rivers, sea, a pond. they're almost spatial archetypes that we recreate architecturally and refer to. The last section takes a handful of practices that continue today and look at them in light of some key elements of architecture today and how we are relating increasingly in depth to ecology, to technology, and to healing and transgression at a whole bunch of different levels. I wanted to introduce a number of key thinkers on bathing to the public so that we can understand it as a field. It's not typically in architectural history understood as a significant group of texts, but as soon as you put them together, they jump out at you as incredibly powerful and interrelated. And the first person I'm going to take is the kind of key historian and thinker of the bath in the 20th century, and that's Siegfried Giedion. And Giedion says that the bath is essentially a social architecture. Bathing cultures are social cultures. And he puts firmly the tradition of bathing architecture into the world of public building. He contrasts in his book, Mechanization Takes Command, the lineage of a kind of individual ablution type with the collective type, which he identifies as being total regeneration. And the students I'm working with right now understand that space of total regeneration is their project assignment, or project 3 assignment. And he kind of rates cultures as how well their techniques of total regeneration bring together the whole person, the whole community, rather than the partial. And the isolation that we experience in our bathtub at home, Giedion would associate with an unfortunate historical development, which has got to do with the mechanization of space, the mechanization of bodies, and mechanization of architecture. He starts to look at Western Europe as a historical spatial temporal network of sweat bathing types. And the provocation to us today when we look at this map of Giedion's is to extend that to the whole world. And I think in its most ambitious form, the book that I wrote would be thousands of pages long and be truly global. Be truly global in its scope and try and chart these evolutions of cultural forms and architectural forms as they've interwoven and influenced each other all over the world. It is very hard, after you look at this map of Giedion's, it is very hard to isolate a single cultural form as being essential. And the history of the public bath, as most architectural histories, problematize essentialism and problematize the idea of a classic fixed type. So when I refer to typologies, bathing typologies in the book, I do not mean to create a reductivist or closed type, but rather a blurry image that seems to appear through a kind of a networked nexus of phenomena. Okay, and I think that type, the use of the word type and archetype, has to be used very consciously because it also has great political import. Okay, and this picture here. So in light of this thesis on impurity, which is going to come up over and over again as we go through this book, we have here a classic example of a hybridized half human, half natural. It's a promise of refreshment, revitalization, and newness. At the same time, the image juxtaposes a kind of a ruin of some aspect of public infrastructure. And I would say that this hybridized nature culture, the admittance of impurity, the admittance of complexity and some confusion is essential to many of the images that I'm going to show you today, and essential to many of the understandings of bathing. And I think that part of the thesis of this book is that bathing cultures and bathing architectures are impure forms that wrestle with notions of purity, culturally, personally, socially, especially. Within this, kind of repressed elements start to emerge from within this kind of a questioning of why architecture and bathing. The segregation and separation is also a huge issue. I think that in the bathing architecture, we see a huge amount of effort to separate and segregate based on age, based on gender, based on race or ability. And the exaggerated, overly determined qualities of these kinds of segregations, historically, they are not ubiquitous. They do not conform to a single code when you move from place to place or time to time. So they're highly relativized, but there is this kind of returning obsession of the separation of bodies, the regulation of bodies. And I think that to take upon ourselves this challenge of Gideon to include the whole, to create spaces of regeneration for everybody, spaces that are inclusive, spaces that embrace more of the human and the non-human, more of ourselves, I think is the challenge for our time. And I think that bathing architecture is an excellent way to look at how we can form more meaningful relationships between each other and between human and non-human environments. Adrian mentioned some of the activities that I've done over the years. It's an example of the kind of site that I'm interested in as an artist and an activist, looking at these spots where people come together and the landscape, the city, the history and practice of the place, and the relationship between bodies, between communities come to the fore. I also want to point out that the past 20 years have given us an incredible wealth of new ideas around communal bathing architectures. This is just one of them. The many, many forms that activists and designers and communities, the many forms that have come out of this include the Flussbad Cup. So this is the Spree River in Berlin. They have an annual swimming contest, a swimming race on a site that they want to turn into a swimmable public river, which is sort of bioremediated, kind of a natural swimming pool / river right around Museum Island in the center of Berlin. It's a fantastic project, utopian project at this point, but they bring attention to their ideas about the health of the water, the health of the city, and the joyful kind of potential of swimming in open air in the middle of cities, a kind of reimagination of cities. And this has been going on over the past 2 decades. I would say that the 21st century could be well defined architecturally just through communal bathing architecture. That's my my main argument for the introduction. Some of the issues that we're looking at here, chapter to chapter, try to bridge artistic production with a kind of theoretical premise, and they try to do that in a way that challenges dominant attitudes towards, in this case, say, the body. And I think that the whole ergonomic tradition, Galen Krantz is the author of this quote here, where Galen Krantz is coming from a design and Alexander technique background. She teaches at Berkeley. She has a body conscious architecture project. And in her book, The Chair, which mostly analyzes how we sit, she has a short section on the bath and realizes how profoundly uncomfortable the typical North American bathtub is if we look at it from the standpoint of the tub. And her insights are connected to a whole host of other writers who I would say come especially from that moment, 60s, 70s, 80s in California. And a few authors we're going to look at, including Krantz and where she comes from. Alexander Kira, Michael Alland, Leonard Cohen, and I would add Lisa Heshong to that list as well. The experience of being in the singular bathtub offers us certain kinds of reverie. As soon as we're allowed to bathe with others, new kinds of possibilities open up. And this is something that Sweat describes so well. Sweat, written by Michael Alland, is one of the first books to describe a more global look at the bath. And he just focuses on sweat bathing. So I would say that Alland is in a continuous lineage with Gideon, but he is also coming from a kind of hippie background, a sensual, earth-based critique, and there's a bit of an anti-culture, anti-aesthetic aspect to his writing, which is really kind of refreshing and of his time, and still is worth a read again in 2020, I think. Michael Alland, and he's actually creating a new project based on sweat that has to do with global bathing traditions today, and that's going to be in the form of a documentary. Bernard Rudofsky, another figure in this lineage of thinkers who are critiquing the standardization and mechanization of the tub, George Nakashima's beautiful tub, and Alexander Kira's bathroom, 1976, a very kind of exhaustive, ergonomic, it's kind of a foundational ergonomic text from Cornell, which is home to a whole line of ergonomic writing and investigations in its relationship to architecture. And Kira discovers the bathroom to be sadly lacking, okay, in every capacity in terms of the individual body. He does note in the beginning of the book that the collective forms of the bath are sadly absent from most North Americans' experience, and he kind of leaves it like that. So most of the focus of the bathroom is on the individual bathtub, bathing for solo. Leonard Cohen, on the other hand, who wrote Undesigning the Bath and started Wet magazine in 1976. Undesigning the Bath is a decade later. Wet magazine was a kind of inaugural counterculture document that included music reviews, cinema, fashion, food. It was like a whole kind of proto new wave lifestyle magazine. Very funny, full of great photography and largely created and curated and envisioned by Corin himself, prolific writer on bathing and the community. So I would say that in contrast to Kira, Corin goes straight into the communal aspects of bathing. And that is the sort of site of his concern and the locus of a kind of a revolutionary impulse, I would say, connected to that time. And I think that revolutionary impulse is worth reflecting on today, using it particularly in the form of a critique of neoliberal capitalism and the kind of isolation that we're experiencing, of course, under COVID to an even more heightened degree. The isolation produced by technologies, in the individual home technology, the niche marketing, which targets everybody as a sort of ever more specific profile, marketing targeted profile. And that aspect of identity in 2020 is starting to show its cracks as we're looking at the election today. I mean, there's a sort of lack of communal ground here. And I think that to reestablish, to reclaim some of this ground is a really key project for architecture and for everybody. So there's certain phenomenological concerns through the text where I drop back into description or story of what it feels like to be floating, for example, and where we go when we float. And then who are the artists who we can look to who have captured something about an experience that we may take for granted when we're designing an architectural project. The temptation to design from the outside of experience rather from the inside is brilliantly critiqued, I think, by some of the artworks that I'm going to show you here today, including this float tank by Carson Holler. Of course, it's connected to all sorts of flotation tank experiments. And the float tank, of course, is something that you can go to today as a kind of shop. You can buy a half hour at a float tank. Another artist in terms of looking at the individual tub, Janine Antony, Eureka. Many of Janine Antony's works use bathing, cleansing, and washing, and the body to bring our attention to things that may be overlooked, especially in terms of the experience and traditions allotted to the feminine as the holder, the container, the nurturer, the cleaner of the body. This is classic sort of 90s installation art tradition, very linked to the bath. Here's Michel de Bourgoin, Blue Monochrome, an installation which is participatory. So this tradition here that I'm showing a little glimpse of, that of immersive art, participatory art, has a huge overlap with bathing architecture as an immersive experience. And it connects to these two readings of the architecture of bathing as I am proposing it. So I'm proposing at once that we look at the architecture of bathing as the kind of typologies that we're discussing, the hammam, the swimming pool, the more elemental forms, the diving board or the rope swing or the shower, fragments. But at the same time, I'm proposing that the architecture of bathing, that's actually the smoke alarm going off in my house, which you will only get this year. I don't know if we're going to be able to hear this. is my voice still audible if I keep talking?
It is, yeah.
It is? Okay, I'm going to keep talking and hope that someone takes care of the smoke alarm. Okay, so I just want to say that that's the first definition of the architecture of bathing. And I want to point to this other definition where I think that experiencing all of architecture in the way that these artists are suggesting that we experience the art gallery, which has been a big sort of a transgressive move in the face of previous definitions of art, the move towards participation, the move towards experience, art as experience. I think it is a provocative set of ideas for architecture to reflect upon. If architecture is all a kind of an immersive participatory experience, then we have a potential kind of expanded field of action. And I think some of these provocations through the book, and hopefully you can get a little bit of a sense of this tonight, the intention is to expand realms of activity and realms of concern for architects, to not lose track of the ways in which architecture's discourse can interact with a whole pile of other fields. And installation art is just one of those. And in the introduction, I talk a bit about movements in art and the movement from, say, environmental art. I'm thinking of James Nesbitt's study on environmental art as characterizing a kind of a period in the 1970s. Today, here in the 21st century, what are the kind of underlying obsessions? In this project by SMAC, we have a kind of an extension of technologies and systems, I would say, so this is 2004, extensions of systems, structures, and relationships. There's a kind of a network quality to this project, and I think it really embodies many of the concerns of the early 2000s. Networks, metabolisms, and relationships, reaching out into relationships. I think these relationships are maybe today in 2020 not quite as fixated on the technologies in their visual representation. And I think that the shift that we've experienced today into architecture, a little bit more currently, not quite, is atmosphere. The kind of next wave of architecture is atmosphere, heavily overlaps architectures of bathing. And the artists and architects who work on projects in these decades almost prefigure more theoretical concerns. I don't think that architecture and the arts are always responding to philosophical texts, for example. If we look to the architectures of bathing and the arts of bathing, we'll often see them, foreshadowing them. And so in this practice of kind of reaching backwards, it is a big project. The book is a big project in reaching backwards historically and trying to sift through stuff, ideas, spaces, practices, technologies that we want to bring forward into the future, bring forward into the now. I'm interested in a few thinkers, and one of them is Henri Lefebvre. I think Henri Lefebvre has a lot to offer us today. His critique of the suppression of the body is just as relevant today as it ever was. And in his book Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment, it was published after his death, he basically explores all of the architectures he can in terms of pleasure, enjoyment, or jouissance in his original. And what he finds is that there is no architecture of enjoyment. He says there is no architecture of pleasure. and that this is a terrible thing, that this is barely conceivable and almost unimaginable. I think this is a provocation for us, you know? But the closest thing he can get to in these examples that he sifts through are the thermae of the ancient Roman world. Of course, these are architectures of enjoyment for the few, not for everybody. And this is something that we have to look at today. Who gets to be included in architectures of enjoyment that we're going to produce? There is a kind of sad and wistful quality to this, looking back at the thermae as ruins. They are ruins. They're not places that exist today or operate today. As we look through the many etchings, drawings, phantasmas of the thermae, we can see some of our wishes or longings for things that used to be that aren't present today. And so the Roman thermae as a place for the whole person included extensive exercise grounds. It included libraries, reading spaces. It included super hot spaces and super cool spaces. And it was a place that you went to for hours and hours and hours. A vast repurposing of these architectures. Here's a church in Rome which reconstructed part of an ancient Roman thermae to become the main kind of nave here. I think it attests to one of the qualities that you see over and over again in a study of bathing architecture, which is repurposing, transformation, and reimagining of a space, reimagining of structures, even stones, fragments for architectures of enjoyment for that moment. There's a lot of transformation going on. And this is a couple of drawings done analyzing Roman thermae, this by Marco. And he's looking at temperature, circulation, and the plans of baths in Pompeii, coming up with some innovative diagrams that try to capture some of the many, many qualities of the spaces simultaneously. The incredible variety of volume indicates incredible variety of acoustics, the social richness, and the scale above all. We can see the tiny human fragments, tiny human figures, sorry, in this drawing. Looking at the spaces as multisensory, this is a try at capturing the layered qualities and the multisensory aspects of these super, super rich architectures. The New York office Matter Design created a microtherm, and when they built this concrete kind of sculpture, it's like a sculpture which is an architecture, which is heated in different parts to different degrees, creating different microclimates depending where you stood or climbed around it. They were thinking about the Roman thermae, and it was interesting to look at the relationship between this kind of bathing, it's a waterless bathing environment designed in 2015. Interesting to look at the shift in scale, incredible civic ambition of the thermae, and the incredible shrinking of the bath, if we think today, of a space that maybe one or two people might occupy. I think there's a great amount of tension there that we can investigate. Another aspect of the thermae in terms of embracing the whole person and the whole community is that it included sexuality, included sensuality. And these sensual spaces get picked up in different traditions of the public bath. For example, I think the gay public bath is rich in this continuity, keeping sexuality, keeping sensuality in connection with the bath program. And this is a picture of the Estonia Hotel. In the basement of the Estonia, where there was the continental baths from 1968 to 75. And what's interesting about the continental baths is how many programs it included. It comes close to a Roman bath in that there were restaurants, saunas, a dance club with DJs. It was the birthplace, here's Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levan, birthplace of house music, continental baths. It was a place where so many different things could happen. There was an STD clinic. Here is a lounge concert space. Rosalind Kind, Barbra Streisand's sister, is performing here to a group of really diverse people wearing, in some instances, towels, in some instances, they're kind of going out, or street clothes. I think the continental baths is a kind of utopian moment just prior to another kind of shrinking, these kind of the rhythms of the public baths as an expanding and a contracting program again, with marking here 1982 coinage of the term AIDS by the CDC is kind of shrinking and retraction from this form of the public bath, so marked by fear of contagion like we're experiencing today, where again, a lot of public bathing establishments have had to close and are struggling to survive and struggling to reimagine themselves. How are they going to move through COVID? This is a thesis project of Rem Koolhaas, Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, The Baths. And the text for this has a very sort of dystopian, it feels like a proto-AIDS dystopia. And I think that these dystopic aspects of the bath are really important to kind of recognize in parallel with their utopian aspects. They're always both kind of present, or hovering at least, around these architectures. I'm just going to read. If I'm at home, I'm not happy, I'm lonely. But then I come here and talk to friends, read the newspaper, or play chess. And the chapter number 3 focuses on community, forms of community that exist here in the last bathhouse in Beijing. It's very tragic kind of loss of so many of these buildings as the pressure for modernization in cities around the world make people shut down public baths or see public bathing spaces as just remnants of a less civilized past that they want to forget. I think this is something that every country struggles with, and anyone who values the community of public baths feels their loss. You know, I think if we don't name public bathing architecture, we don't name public bathing cultures globally, if we don't have a kind of structure or framework for them in our imagination, they'll easily slip away. And part of this project also includes making connections between historical, defunct, and present day bathing cultures, and trying to hold them together, capture them, and support connectivity and conversation between them internationally. Some public bathing architectures reinvent themselves with completely different programs. And this is a very typical program here at Sky the Bathhouse in Tokyo, where it turns into an art gallery. Many, many art and performance spaces globally are public bathing spaces. Another form of inclusivity has to do with maintenance and the maintenance of life, maintenance activities around here, the Baths and Laundry of St. James. This is a little section on the laundry, the still functioning laundromat in the Ironmonger's Row baths. The laundromat is a social space. It is a kind of a public space, halfway between public and community space. And in the Ironmonger's Row public baths, which was recently renovated, Tim Ronald's architects in 2014, they maintained the public laundry as part of it, which I think is really kind of excellent. In the book, I go through a few different, I'm not going to show you all of the drawings through the book, but trying to understand these spaces as networks of functions and their adjacencies. This is the Tim Ronald's renovation where they reimagined the form of the Victorian Turkish bath. Victorian Turkish bath, already talking about hybrids, impurity and fantasy. Victorian Turkish baths, Malkin Schifrin has a great book on their history, but they're baths, maybe, one person went to Turkey and then hundreds of people dream of going to Turkey and create kind of fantasies. This is a Harrogate Royal Baths. This is a kind of a extreme, large version of a Victorian Turkish bath, but it contains a version of a sweating suite that moves from cool to warmer to hotter to hottest on a kind of a cycle. Includes a big resting area, resting and relaxation being a really important part of any public bathing program, and imagines it with a kind of Orientalist flourish. And I think as we sift through our relationships with colonial heritage and architecture, we really have to address that fantasy of the other aspect in the architecture of the bath. It's just right up there. It's always looking at you. It's always asking you, what possible tradition, hybrid are we looking at here? And what is real and what is projection? What is a wish, an unfulfilled wish of that group of people that they imagine somebody else is doing somewhere else? I think the Victorian Turkish bath as an imagined space of relaxation, infinite time, sociality that was not being marked by the clock or by the world of work. Especially the world of work is exiled from some of these spaces. And I think I'm going to show a few images later, more about the art of that. And here we have a few different forms of these public infrastructures of community bathing around the archetype of the well, including the step wells of India, especially Northwest India. And I end this chapter looking at Kai Guoshan's Cultural Melting Bath project. And he created this project in a number of different locations, both temporary and permanent versions of it. It imports water soaked in herbs, herbs imported from China, rocks thought to have healing properties, also imported from China. And the proposition is that you enter the gallery and sit in the tub with people who you don't know, people who happen to be in the gallery with you. It obviously creates a social space. It obviously creates a kind of an art experience, and it's doing this using the bath as both a kind of metaphor and a literal kind of energetic material proposition. That chapter is on the waterfall, and I'm quoting Hippocrates and a few other more ancient writers. In these water sections, you find a lot of traditions of writing about the specific qualities of water and its properties from a philosophical standpoint or a poetic standpoint that's yet mixed with science. And I think this is one of the challenges of the architecture of bathing today, when we inherit forms, storytelling, mythology, social practices. What is the science, and how can we pull these qualities of water into our lives in a kind of intelligent, contemporary way, sifting out maybe erroneous ideas that are more connected to magical thinking, but respecting magical thinking and respecting the symbolic as we start to walk through. And I think that creating architectures without understanding their symbolic import often leads us to reinscribe unconsciously structures of, be they structures of oppression or segregation, or forms that are speaking to people in a way that we don't intend because of inattention to their kind of symbolic relevance. And that's something that Lawrence Halprin is so inspiring about. The intersection between art and architecture and bathing is very, very beautifully brought together in the work of Lawrence and Anna Halprin. She's a choreographer and dancer. He's a landscape architect. And the whole series of the waterfalls in Portland, which were intended to be jumped into, intended to be turned into art spaces, sort of teach us something about the waterfall that we may have forgotten culturally. Again, a long time ago, here we have some people jumping into the Trevi Fountain. The public fountain used to be a place to enter, to get water from, to even swim in, splash around in. And I can see that some fountains in the world still function this way. And these are fountains in Basel where the residents maintain that tradition of jumping and playing in the fountains. One of the few contemporary fountains of kind of great architectural import, I think, is the Gustafsson Porter Baumann Princess of Wales Memorial Fountain, where you're encouraged to enter, you're encouraged to touch and play into this space. And I think of writers like Ian Borden's Skateboard in the City. Whenever I look at this particular project, the provocation that the city is a place of play, that it can be tactilely reappropriated for pleasure and loosened from the kind of over inscription of hierarchy and official use. Symbolism and the water slides. So I talked about purity and impurity before, and some of the key thinkers around this include Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, Gaston Bachelard and Luce Rigouret come together here to start to explore what are we dealing with in the symbolic imagination when we talk about water, the search for purity, the search for renewal that water somewhat promises, how important it is as a public function of pre-cleaning, washing and cleaning, not just for the surface of the skin in a hygienic fashion. A lot of the architectures of bathing do not make any sense if we try to understand them from a purely functional perspective. They're incomprehensible from a purely functional perspective. Tirta Empul in Bali is a ritual communal bath with many water sources coming from many different springs. And each spring is said to have different qualities that are going to interact with you mentally and physically. Ritual cleansing before entering the mosque. Ritual bathing in the form of baptism. All of these belong in bathing culture. And the application of dirt in the mud bath, impurity, then to wash off, creates greater purity. How does that happen? This is Vichy. And whenever I see a bottle of Vichy water, I think of this complex, a kind of cultural complex around pure spring water. and what that spring water promises us, which is water that has never been touched. And if we think that the consumption of bottled water is having a kind of injurious effect on the environment, we have to somehow understand its symbolic power and resonance. People still keep buying bottled water, even if they know what its carbon footprint is. I think that we need to take a more generous, larger view of some of the symbolic offerings that things are giving us and see if we can provide another equally symbolically rich alternative that matches our values. And it's interesting to see the bath as a kind of site of discussion here, Orevina Katz's MKV installation, and she's done a few of these which try and reappropriate the tradition of the Jewish mikveh for contemporary life, and to include rather than exclude participants, to recognize the mikveh as at its core, rejuvenation and a new start, a new cycle, loosen some of the associations which are heavily heteronormative and patriarchal, and form, I think these kinds of seeds of new bathing practices, new bathing cultures, which is now expanded to a whole queering the mikveh project, which is international, super, super rich and super, super relevant for our time. Reimagining these spaces in their full, recognizing their full symbolic import and being able to play with that. Here's Stephen thinking about cycles and renewal in a bathing space. And I'm going to try, I can feel that the number of slides I have are kind of in excess of the time. So some of these things I'm just going to show as provocations. I'm going to leave some of the longer texts out of this. Next chapter is the sea and rhythm. And here again, I look at Lefebvre and the rhythm analytic method. Also beautiful, beautiful reverse symbolism in terms of reimagining, reappropriating the symbolic realm as something to be played with. I love Sandor Ferenci's Thalassa. In accordance with the reverse symbolism already met several times, the mother would properly be the symbol of and partial substitute for the sea, and not the other way about. So just to see that maternal, the overdetermination of the maternal with the sea, that the sea is the mother somehow. In Thalassa, the proposition, very ecologically provocative proposition, that the mother is actually post-humanly the symbol for the sea, is quite powerful. And the spatial implications of territory and the beach, the architectures of the beach, often very improvisational and light and temporary, just as important as the heavy. A still from the film Moonlight, which really holds that super powerful import of the overdetermination of the maternal, and Chiron, the main character, whose mother is Nereid, I think. There's a beach posto in Rio. So some of the different architectures of the sea include the pier. And once we can see the type of the pier, we can reinterpret it architecturally as something new. All kinds of new architectures get woven out of simple typologies and forms that, again, just like symbolic forms, get to be played with and reinterpreted once we kind of recognize them. I think that's a wonderful teaching of the architecture of bathing. Also, its fugitiveness related to style. This is a section about the tides, the relationship between the tides and the Sutro baths in San Francisco, ultimately washing away as the baths they caught fire, they fell into disuse. What remains now is an incredible tidalscape, kind of reminiscent of the beautiful Leka pools by Caesar. It's kind of edge of the waves, the power of the waves and power of the tides to create new architectures. Architectures of relationality is what I think they promise. And at the next moment kind of pull us in away from those broader landscape relationships into very small spaces where it's almost as if the full force of the landscape is somehow felt. And I think that this function that architectures of bathing sometimes can have is that landscape microcosm and somewhat the taming of a super powerful force which would kill you if you didn't have some protection from. And to say that this is a whirlpool, you know, we know what the whirlpool bath is. It's very pleasant, it's small. It's a taming of a huge natural whirlpool. Symbolism in the river, flow, different associations of flow with rivers and architectures of rivers, river bathing in the Ghat, and the beautiful river baths of Zurich here, the temporary floating baths that can actually move. This is from Bad Stadthaus in Zurich, and it has a kind of gender specificity. It's women's only baths, a huge history of these gender segregated bathing institutions. What do they mean? There's a huge, I think, struggle that we have today over specifying gender. There is a relativity of gender that people maybe in the 19th century didn't experience, and their emphasis on making clear-cut distinctions between gender, I think, is routinely undone by the bathing architectures themselves. The overdetermination revealing the fragility of it. And I love this as a kind of current read on bathing in a river. It's a submerged pathway through a deep river by Erkman in Münster in 2017. So many great architectures of river bathing, and they're beautifully. This is just one example of many exhibitions that have happened over the past, I would say, past decade. International exhibitions that look at bathing architectures, cities, but maybe they're not all calling themselves explicitly bathing architectural exhibitions, but I think they all belong together. They all belong together. The river bathing boats of Paris and all these floating architectures belong to architectures of bathing. Tiny cubicles in here, and here the space. I use this image in the current project outline that I have, where we're talking about the new form of social space. So Ben Deligny had so many years to reinvent itself and repurpose itself. Other floating river architectures and the evolution of kind of increasing ecological consciousness and connectivity, reaching out into the systems, river networks of the cities as pleasure spaces, expressly in post-industrial urban sites, right? The reclamation of these sites has a kind of beautiful glow to it, but they also have to be recognized as part of the offshoring of employment. The fact that okay. So I just have a little time text here. Yeah. So I'm thinking I should end in the next like 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to go through a little bit quickly. Pools, the form of the pool, different incredible provocations of the pool as a volumetric structure, recognizing structure of space and structure of water as volume, and the pure kind of joy of volumetric play. That in a way is connected to ferroconcrete and the 20th century, explorations in the 20th century. The diving board and its provocation for new forms of space making and form making, deeply intertwined the body and positions. Architectures like that of Zaha's look into diving experientially. Pond, depth, reflection, immersion, and goo. Places that bring you into goo, into something which is impure, and the rich biodiversity into which the bather dives in pond bathing. We're not looking in pond bathing for even Illich's H2O, a purified, rarefied, chlorinated, clear substance. We're looking to bathe in something that's deeper, more complex, and possibly more nourishing. And I look at some amazing architects of bathing like Julia Morgan in here, who designed numerous swimming pools way ahead of her time, often with very explicitly feminist programs, clients, and strategies. The Banya, the next set look at these typologies such as Banya sauna, Sento, and artists who take on the provocation, some of the key qualities of these spaces, explore them in how we might reinterpret them today. And here are some student projects which draw on those artworks, draw on the qualities of immersion in the Banya, immersion in materials, immersion in the mikveh, and some of the key qualities of the Banya start to emerge in ways that we can reinterpret them for future possible architectures and cultural rituals. And I think there's some profound thinkers and profound artworks that draw us into these aspects of ritual, aspects of immersion, and aspects of ecological networks. So above all, I think that these architectures expose our indebtedness to interrelationality, our indebtedness to lines and evolutions of historical forms, and how interconnected all of these forms are globally. The forms do not stop where a political border ends. Here's Vanessa looking deeply at ritual in terms of understanding a simple volume of a mikveh bath in Mexico City. The way in which water and materiality impact us as porous bodies is the focus of this chapter. And here's Siggy's look at mineral accretion on subsurface pool materials, the emanation of smell, humidity, moisture, and heat. These architectures of the Jimjilbang really open up, I think, the porous body as like a key apprehension that everybody's body is porous. The sweating, the collective evaporation of that sweat, and the surfaces of the Jimjilbang all point to how we are impacted by building materials in really, really profound ways that we don't even understand. How is it that sitting in the gold room, or here Svarsh sitting, touching the cedar wood, how do these different building materials impact us, as building users? I think there's a lot more going on in terms of our interaction, with the seat that we're sitting on, the wall that we're leaning on, or the stone that we're leaning against here, than we might think. And the bathing architecture of the Jimjilbang and all of these this is an immersive bath in cedar enzymes. They all point to a kind of a porous body, not only through the nose, the mouth, the eyes, but through the skin itself. It kind of feels like a slightly unexplored horizon in non-bathing architectures. The sonnet chapter focuses on contrast and very much the thermal delight in architecture promised by Lisa Heschong in her wonderful book of that title. The capacity of architects to play with thermal contrast for the purpose of delight is here explored a little bit by Anna in this diagram, and Olivia's relationship to the tide here, and Kian's rhythms of contrast that he finds in his own bathroom through the hours of the day and night. And there's a section on cinema and immersive ritual that uses contrast, and that hinge point in the work of Le Corbusier comes out really, really well in the work of Shannon Bull, who studied his architecture closely. And then the sort of contrast bathing as type in the sauna identifies elements that we're always using in any kind of architecture, providing contrast in atmosphere, contrast in materiality, contrast in light is a tool of the designer. Artificiality and the micro landscape, which I spoke of before, look at through a whole bunch of different complex examples. And this is one key touchstone in the book, this image of the Blue Lagoon taken by Laura McPhee and Virginia Behan, discussed in light of Melanie Klein and the issue of pollution. Again, what is symbolically at work in our polluting of our own environments, our own waters and air that we rely on? And in recognizing that, are there creative, playful, and enjoyable architectures that can be generated from it? And here's a really interesting example of it, is the transformation of the Blue Lagoon, which was a byproduct. This water is a byproduct of a industrial process, an energy plant that gets repurposed into eventually a public bathing space that is delightful and creative. And I just want to do a small advertisement here for an event. There's a couple of events in November. Mikael Alland, author of Sweat, Katie Bracker of the British Sauna Society, Pia Lindman, whose project you saw flash by, Aziza Chouni from Fez and U of T Architecture School on Sidi Harazem, and Marcus Zotz from Basalt Architects, who designed the Blue Lagoon project that you just saw, are all going to be sitting in a round table with us next Thursday at lunchtime. And I hope you all can come and continue this conversation a little bit more. Okay.
Thanks so much, Christie.
Thanks.
That was amazing. I think we're getting close to 7:30, but it would be nice to be able to have a little bit of questions about your book. So I think we should take a little bit of time for that, and maybe Usually we run about an hour and a half, but maybe we can run 15 or 20 minutes over. And if anyone has any questions for Christie about the talk, just put your hand up, I guess, your virtual hand. Dean, hello. Are you?
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, good you can hear me. Hey, Christie.
Dean, hi.
Hi, really nice to hear your talk. And I do have one question, because I remember years and years ago talking with you about baths, and it was the first time I really realized what was happening even in Toronto. And I guess the thing I wanted to ask you is just one thing in all your studying about baths and community, like one kind of nugget that you go, oh my God, I didn't realize this is what I was going to end up thinking about this whole thing.
You mean like one thing that like super surprised me that was always there, but I didn't really get it?
Yeah, what either that you didn't get or that you discovered in all of this research and I mean, you've read so much about the whole kind of community side of it and actual projects throughout history, and just, I don't know, like, to me, I'm listening to you and I go, oh my God, I never really thought about things like that before. So I'm wondering if there's anything in all of these kind of 10 years of study that really stand out for you as one of those aha moments.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of them I would say has got to do with this idea that there's public space and private space, but there's something else in between. And that is something that's something else in between, which I'm thinking of now as community space, is a kind of key that helps me understand some bathing spaces, where I want to use the word public bathing because people understand that it's public, not private. But I think that is one definite aha thing, that all of these spaces try and form a sense of inclusion and community within them, even if it's just temporary. And that is kind of like a key to a great experience in one of these places, that you leave feeling like you've become part of a community.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, thanks.
I have a question, Christie. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about public space, and it strikes me that like people being naked or near naked in public space is a really important part of their intersubjectivity. Like that somehow the vulnerability of bodies in baths is part of what makes them such unique and interesting places for people to come together. The fact that they're people's like symbolic exoskeleton has been shed, puts them more on an equal footing. And I'm wondering, yeah, if you have thoughts about that, the kind of the vulnerability of bodies.
Yeah, I think it's super, super important. And I mean, that makes me think of this whole, Van Gennep and the liminal space, where you leave your regular social experience and go into a place or a state which is connected to ritual. And the first thing that liminal space requires of you is that you remove your previous self. You remove the signs of your status. You remove the signs of your wealth or identity, and you become temporarily identityless, and that is where some kind of renewal happens, And I think it's interesting in certain cultures, especially in Finland and in Japan. I've had people tell me this very emphatically, that it is important that you remove everything because you don't want anyone, you're not trying to show off there, and you don't want anyone to know who you are in terms of social standing. That the removal of that social standing is a leveler, and that these are spaces which are intended to make all people equal. Right? Anything that you have on could sign your non-equalness to other people. And so I just think that, vulnerability, what you're talking about, vulnerability, that it has, that is a kind of liberatory, slightly utopian, maybe interpretation of your question, because there's of course other sides where our vulnerability and exposure in those spaces, not everybody is up to that. Being vulnerable, it's like, with who can you feel that way? In what situation do you trust that you can? And of course, the dark side, the dystopic side of these baths is that in exposing yourself in a public bathing space, and this includes in many places, in the United States, not just historically, but today, I just read an article about a group of young Black men going to a beach and being yelled at and then beaten up because they don't belong here. They are told by their white attackers that they don't belong here. And so that was a kind of a removal of clothing, protection, neighborhood, car, sitting on the beach, and that exposure resulted in violence, okay? And that is not the only, instance of that. So I think that it's a two-sided thing there, that when we allow ourselves to become vulnerable and exposed, we are taking a risk, right? And that risk has to be dealt with, and with empathy and with understanding by a designer, for sure.
Thanks, Christie. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes. There's two questions. Sarah first, Sarah Mason, and then Kian.
Hi, Christie. Thanks for your talk. I guess I kind of had a follow-up question to Adrian's question, and I came into the talk a bit late, so I don't know whether you covered it in the presentation. I just missed it. But I guess I'm wondering, in North America, personal baths and having a bath in your house, mm-hmm. and having that as an option for people, and how that kind of idea of bathing maybe affects in North America, our idea of the public bath, and whether you considered that in your research or saw that as a way that has affected how people bathe in other places, and just what your thoughts are on the bath in the home,
Yeah.
How does that affect people's willingness or desire to go out to a public bath, and whether it does have an impact, or whether, people will go to a public bath anyway if they want to go.
Right. I think I think it's a really important issue, and I hope I have written about it adequately. I think that the dawn of the private bath, is connected to the dawn of personal plumbing in the home. It is a historical phenomenon, right? That people are supposed to have their own shower and their own bathtub in their own apartment. And this, if we say historically, this is 100 years ago. Very recently, in the big picture of things, before that, most people bathed together, and still around the world, lots of people bathe together out of a kind of practical necessity, So I think, one aspect of your question that's interesting is that we have chosen to sort of encourage / impose that norm onto people, or you could say, offer it to people, but it is now offered as a sign of equivalency to Western affluence, right? Maybe in different parts of the world where the solitary home bath had not yet entered in to that culture, it is posited as a progressive item. Okay? And there are all kinds of hygiene and personal health issues that support that. And I'm not saying that having your own bathtub at home is a bad thing, but I think it's just like so many other aspects of architecture where we take something for granted because we were born into it, and we think that's the way it's always been. And it has not. It's very, very recent. And just to, I think, recognize and stay close to the communal roots of bathing, if we keep that in mind, then we can bring more love and affection to the building of those places and try and understand what they might offer us besides simple hygiene. You know, if we have hygiene taken care of because we all have a shower at home, why would we make a communal bathing space, or why should a city spend a huge amount of money on a new communal bathing space? That's what I hopefully have tried to mark out through this book, is that these spaces offer us so much more in terms of connectivity and relationship to each other and to our environment.
Great, that's really lovely response to that question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Kian, do you have a question still?
Yeah, I have a question sort of similar to Adrian's question about body vulnerability. And if you've seen any trends, maybe even in the last 30 years, about the sort of fear of danger of swimming in the lake or the river or the sea, despite that being maybe perhaps part of the pleasure of doing that. Like, has there been a decline? Has there been, when I visit Lake Ontario, there's all sorts of signs, danger, everything. Has there been anything that's come of that in your research?
Well, what I'm really fascinated by is that there has been a wave, and when I say that in the past, in the past 20 years, there has been a resurgence in public demand for swimmable bodies of water. Okay? So if the 20th century is characterized by a steady decline in swimmable, drinkable fresh water, the 21st century, I think, is going to be the century in increasing, accelerated demand towards a greater responsibility on the part of the collective, whatever name you give the collective, to fixing that, to addressing that problem. And I think it's really exciting how so many bathing cultures that are emerging today, especially, I do want to note, under COVID, the increase in wild swimming, open water swimming, cold water swimming groups on Facebook, just for example, okay, of what I'm talking about here. It's an explosion, and the collective nature of these groups is going to carry increasing political pressure and power as people want to swim in their local river or their local beach and think that they ought to be able to. See, that's the big shift that this century is about. People today think, I ought to be able to swim at the beach here in Toronto. And why can't I? Okay. I think that's really encouraging. It's really exciting. Look at the city of Kingston. City of Kingston was dumping raw sewage into their harbor. And what did they decide? They decided collectively that they wanted to swim there. They upgraded, this is all quite recently, now they upgraded their municipal water treatment center, and now they have the Gord Downey swimming pier where you can go and get a suntan and jump in the river. I mean, these things are happening all over the world, and I think it's really exciting. I'm not sure if that's a perfect overlap with your question, Kim.
No, I think it's great. I think it's interesting. Just a quick follow-up about maybe, have you seen anything, especially with kids? Like, you see playgrounds go from metal to plastic. Has there been that same thing with swimming pools sort of becoming more safe, coddled environments, or maybe not. I'm not.
Yeah, that's like a whole other thing. I mean, just in the city of Toronto, I used to spend my time writing politicians to stop closing wading pools, because I recognize that the wading pool is a higher risk environment than a splash pad. Okay? And I was like a wading pool activist for many years, trying to like promote awareness of the wading pools as having these other qualities, the qualities of immersion and collectivity, slow movement, relaxation, different from a splash pad, which is all about action, mechanical stuff, machines, and movement, right? So I will say that movement towards safety and away from the body of water, a still container of water like a swimming pool, I think there has been a steady decline in those types of spaces, because it saves you money when you don't need lifeguards, and but in return we lose some. I think we really lose something.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
So this is your last chance for questions.
There's a question. There's a couple.
Are there?
Yeah, there's Manar, and Mikkel Alland is here asking a question.
Wait. Well, jump in. Manar, do you want to jump in?
Yes, hi. So good to see both of you. And congratulations, Christie, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I had a couple of questions. So I had questions in terms of the history of the sensuality of the gaze, or the gradients of this sensual gaze at the naked, vulnerable body, and how it appears as problematic or not, and issues of shame in bathing and exposing yourself, and when that starts to appear, and how you encountered that in the history books or that you looked at regarding bathing, and then questions of hygiene, and when is chlorine introduced, and when are issues of hygiene, when do they come to the foreground or to the fore? Yeah, I know those are very big questions, but I'm just curious about, and very different, probably in different contexts, but I'd love to hear if you could point to specific one or two instances or cases or anecdotes that you encountered that may not have made it into the book.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'm afraid I had to fly through a number of slides, but I want to just go back to, if you can remember, I had a shot of the Ingres circular painting of the women in the hammam, and then the Sylvia Slay painting, which is a kind of inversion of, she's a female painter painting. That's her version. Sylvia Slay's, it's like men at the hammam, okay? So these two paintings were kind of put together in connection with the wonderful book called Bathing Bodies Beauty by Linda Noshlin. And I think Linda Noshlin she's recently died, a great art historian who wrote just about these traditions of the gaze and seeing and being seen from an art historical perspective that I try to get into in a section. I think she's really interesting to read about that. And then in that chunk of writing, I turned to Ronnie Horn and her photo collage. It's called Her, and Her, and she's shooting inside of a woman's change room, and it starts to create, as you start to look at it, a whole universe of seeing and being seen, and the kind of erotic space of the change room as a super rich and dynamic space, also as a homosocial space usually, and what that means in terms of same-sex eroticism. So that is one chunk of the book, and people to look at and read about, and to read on that topic. Another thing that comes to mind is that, Admiral Perry lands on Japan. Japan has been like closed for decades and decades. And in the end of the 18th century, Admiral Perry shows up on his boat, and all these Americans finally land and start wandering through Japan, which has only been for Japanese people. And one of the first things that freaks them out is that people are bathing in public baths without a division, without a gender division. That everybody's bathing together. It doesn't matter if you're old or young, or male or female or anything. And so the way in which the gaze of the Americans gets imprinted on the Japanese psyche historically is often written about. And that is something that I think is worth researching if that's a focus of yours in terms of the history of bathing, because, at this point now, especially young Japanese, older Japanese like to berate younger Japanese for wearing swimsuits in the baths, because they're introducing dirt. It's impure, the swimsuit. And for the younger Japanese, many people of younger generations have internalized that American gaze, right?
Thank you.
Just leaving on that. Mikhail. Oh, your audio is off.
Yeah, how's that? Can you hear me?
Hi, yeah. How are you?
God, great talk. What a great book, Christie. I'm just so happy for you, and happy for all of us to have this work that we can refer to now. I'm really concerned about public bathing in the days and times of COVID. Mm-hmm. And I've watched, as you know, I've been around a little while, and I watched what happened in the late 70s, early 80s, when we were on a wonderful trajectory, as we are now, with bathing just starting to take off. And you talked a little bit about the 60s and the 70s. And just to see it squashed by the AIDS epidemic, it's very vivid in my mind, and it haunts me. And now we're seeing what's happening, obviously, with the public baths all over the world, literally closing down, and people being scared to get together in the bath. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that. But I wanted to say that there was something encouraging that you just talked about with the whole phenomena of bathing in open water, because here in San Francisco, in the aquatic park right now, and all the areas where people can jump in the bay, it's just amazingly crowded with people swimming. So there's I guess what I'm looking for, a little, rays of hope. But yeah. In terms of the greater picture of public bathing and COVID, what are your thoughts on that? Where are we going? Give me some hope.
Yeah, well, that's a big hope. I feel I do track somewhat all of the struggles that people are having all around the world to keep their spaces alive, to keep people coming to somehow, they're opening and closing and trying to adapt to the new regulations, and then the regulation changes and they have to close again, and the cleaning and everything. It's like it really is depressing and tough for a lot of people. I think that this outdoor, on the other hand, there have been conversations with people over the past few weeks who are trying to reimagine their space from an architectural standpoint. Who are like, wait a minute, maybe it's not that I have to disinfect more. Maybe I need to change the architecture here so that I understand contagion from the outset. How do we get more fresh air into these spaces? How could I change my venue so that it met the concerns of the day, just like through structure rather through use and regulation and prohibition, because that's the thing that shuts it down and makes it less exciting to go there. And you know, there's people like you're going to be on a panel with Katie Bracker there, who started the Brighton beach box sauna, and they've had those kind of challenges. But you know, I think there are all kinds of ways that people can adapt from an architectural, not just a use perspective. And I think that the open air bathing is encouraging for sure. How many other bathing traditions have already got outdoor baths in them? You know, is there a way that the onsen could just subtly adapt itself so that people could flow through and use the outdoor bath safely? I don't know. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough, Michaela. I think that those the open water swimmers are definitely the brightest light that I can see.
Yeah.
And then there's also maybe people trying to rethink who can go in at once. Are we going to go in bubbles? You know, that seems depressing for people, like, you know, because the whole point is to go to a place and meet people who aren't in your bubble. That's what they're awesome at. They're awesome at bringing you in contact with people who might look at the world different from you or be different from you.
Yeah. Well, to be determined.
To be determined.
Yeah.
Do you see
open end?
Do you see? Well, you see the swimmers, the open water swimmers in San Francisco, and that's growing in number.
Yeah, I see that, but you know, I worry about, you know, where I come from the sweat bath, you know, and I love how your world is expansive and you include all bathing, and I wish I was able to do that as well, but I tend to be kind of more simply focused on containers. These are, you know, a sweat bath is a containment. That's how it works. You go into a chamber that's heated and you sweat. And that's kind of the basic ingredient to the hammam, to the temescal, to the banya, to the sauna. And you can't get away from the fact that it's a containment. It's a box. And you're putting people together in a box. And this is where the closures are happening in any kind of contained space. So I'm worried, you know, that I see there's a movement towards small barrel type saunas. People want their own, back to their own individual type of bath. So kind of going the opposite way that I want to go, which is towards communal bathing. So I see people still wanting to sweat, but doing it in their own small contained space. So we're getting away from what, you know, we both believe in, which is the communal aspect. So I don't know. I'm worried. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I'm worried too. I mean, identify COVID, AIDS, the medieval stew that put an end to the trajectory, the whole lineage of public bathing culture in Western Europe. Things like the plague, it kind of ruined it.
Yeah, it did. Well, for a while, but I like what you said. Where, you know, there's expansion and there's contraction. It just seems to be part of it. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you. See you next week.
Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you see any other questions, Christie? I can't see any.
I don't see any.
So maybe we should say thanks so much, Christie, for your talk. It was, I mean, I've heard about this project for a long time, probably for certainly a decade, probably a couple. And it's amazing to see it come together and to hear you talk about it, and to see it in the context of architecture and an architecture school, which I didn't quite understand all the time how that would come together. And I think it's amazing to see you tell an architectural history, but I think also develop a kind of architectural theory about an architecture of pleasure, about an architecture of relation, and about an architecture of impurity. And I think you really challenge us to think architecture very differently through this like far-ranging case that you're following. So thanks so much, Christie, for this talk and for this book.
Thanks for having me at the school, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's really, really great to have this forum, and great to have this community, you know, core community and expanded community of all the people whose names I see here. It's great to see you. Thank you. Thank you.